fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
The concept of ESG. There's a lot of people, I know you don't like ESG as a concept, as a machine, because what it is stakeholder capitalism. What ESG is the demand that corporations have a larger say and a larger role to play in society. So yes, we need to take a stand on cultural issues, political issues, all that stuff. Any other day of the week, if we tweaked a few things about ESG, everyone on the right would love it. And I just want to establish that. And I know you don't, because you don't like that premise at all. You and many others might reject that premise. But
you got me.
If you're on the right and you're like a fascist, if you're a national socialist, if you're a deep ecologist, like there's nothing about the biggest corporations in the world saying, I'm going to take a positive role in like green energy. Most of the like eco extremists would actually like that on our side. And if you were, what we don't like is the trans stuff. What we don't like is the anti-natalist stuff. What we don't like, the actual components, the inputs. But if you were to swap those out and swap in, I don't know, trad things, Christian things, pro-natalist things, like everyone would fucking love it. That is essentially fascism.
I want to say, all else being equal, and I will make clear what the all else is in a second. All else being equal, the concept of creating publicly a metric like ESG, which is really, it doesn't even have to have an institution behind it, although ESG was created by the UN, I believe. But like we could create a natality system, we call it like NSG. And we say that NSG represents how companies fare in terms of promoting the white race. And then they get a score, and because there's a score, there's a network effect that causes people to buy into them, and because people buying in, then those companies want to get a higher score. So like this is actually good. I agree with all of this.
Let me give you an example. Or we measure companies based on how much maternity leave they give for family, how much they promote pro-family thing, and stuff like that.
The point is, if it's non-governmental, it's just a thing that publicly we as investors and even retail investors, is something that we discuss. It's something that we all look at when we make our retirement investments or whatever, right? That is actually completely consistent with free market capitalism. I have no problem with that at all. In fact, I think we need more of it. I think we should actually be trying to create metrics like that, because it is a way that we can take places like BlackRock. We can actually turn BlackRock around. Larry Fink, he doesn't own the company, right? He just works there and owns a lot of stock. But we could put one of our guys in charge of BlackRock and it would become our company overnight, because that's how it works. My actual problem with it, just because you brought up the fact that I would disagree with it, it's actually because companies aren't real. Companies aren't people. Corporations do not bear responsibility for anything. And by asking quote-unquote corporations to make decisions when they do bad things, and we want to hold the quote-unquote corporation responsible, the big problem I have with that is heads don't roll, because nobody is responsible, because it's a fucking corporation. I don't think corporations in their current instantiation should exist at all. We should have companies writ 1850, where the people who made the decisions, who hold stock and were involved, should do prison time if something goes wrong. That's my big issue with it. But it's not general, like all else being equal, though. Yeah, we should have right-wing ESG.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to think. Like when people are coming at this, it's like, are you against the mechanism or are you just against the inputs? I think it's important for people to ask themselves which they're against. Because there's some people who might like the premise but don't. And hey, here's another option. Maybe it can never be used for our stuff. Maybe the only reason this is being used is as a destabilization and disruption effort. That could be it too. It could come to pass that they will just never allow us to hijack this ever again, and it's only being used to, disrupt the working class, destroy the middle class, to wage a war on coal and oil, and that once it's destroyed, maybe ESG goes away. That could be it too.
I will make a prediction, and I think it's not really a prediction. It's kind of just like, it's almost physics to me. But if there was some kind of political revolution, and we managed to, over 50 years, completely change the landscape of the planet, and it became much more amenable to us, like it became our utopia. If we did that, without fundamentally altering the markets, if it was purely bullets and had nothing to do with finance, you would wind up with right-wing ESG all over the fucking place. Because my point is it is actually just natural to the system of financial markets. Like, and even ESG itself is, like I said earlier, is not unique. There's 1,000 other metrics, and every year people dream up new metrics like that, and it's just ways of people interpreting the value of companies and trying to predict where they're going to go. Like, if you have financial markets, if you have a stock market, you're always going to have metrics like this.
I agree with that completely. And we spent a lot of time on this. I think we covered everything that I wanted to cover on that. And I wanted to use that as a jumping off point because I think this is related to the book we're going to discuss today. And the book we're going to discuss today is connected to the book we discussed last episode, which was Claws of the Panda, about the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into Canadian politics, Canadian business, essentially Canada writ large. This, I think, is a similar book, but takes a different angle. It mentions that as well, but takes more of the angle of the criminal aspect. This book is titled Willful Blindness. It's written by Sam Cooper. The subtitle is How a Criminal Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and Chinese Communist Party Agents Infiltrated the West. And while we talk about the West, what we really mean is Canada, and what we really, really mean is Vancouver, British Columbia. Vancouver, which already has a reputation, and we discussed this earlier in the show, but has a reputation of being just a landing pad for Chinese immigration, but also Chinese control. And everyone's kind of aware that the Chinese Communist Party owns half of the city of Vancouver, but no one really knows what the implications of that are. Why are they doing that? What does that mean for everyone? So a lot of this comes back to this book. It has a lot to do with the Triads.
Federal prosecutors killed a massive probe here in BC after exposing a secret police informant by mistake. Global News investigative reporter Sam Cooper broke this story and joins us now from Ottawa. Sam, thanks for joining us. What did you uncover here?
That's right. The RCMP investigation was to an alleged underground bank in Richmond that has been estimated to be laundering over $1 billion Canadian per year for international drug gains, including Chinese triads and Mexican cartels. Another alleged element was helping Chinese high rollers launder money through BC casinos into Vancouver real estate. And what we have found is that the case blew up because in the evidence disclosure process, so much evidence was gathered, a mistake was made when evidence was shared for the defense, with the defense, so the case could go forward. The Crown and the police made a mistake vetting this information, and so this showed the identity of an informant. The fear was that if the case went forward, the informant could be killed, and that's why charges were dropped.
Yeah, well, we saw they were dropped a little while ago. We didn't know why. Now, this was believed to be the largest money laundering probe in Canadian history. Does this underline a weakness in the justice system?
Absolutely. What the experts have already said is that the RCMP doesn't have the leadership or resources to tackle large international money laundering and drug trafficking investigations.
It involves a bit of history about how it got to this state. So how it starts was Vancouver has always been a choice destination for Chinese gambling whales. And by whales, we mean like the elite of the Chinese Communist Party, the people who got all the money and all the power, but they love to gamble. Gambling is massive in China. Literally every Chinese person knows how to gamble. And if you see a Chinese person not eating Chinese food, they are gambling. And you heard that here first. You heard that here last.
It's true, folks. It's true.
Now, the problem is, what they noticed was that these casinos, mainly like the River Rock Casino, factors very, very heavily into this book. And it's kind of the ground zero for all this. But what they found was that these locations, specifically River Rock, were a giant money laundering spot.
A lawsuit between BC's Great Canadian Casinos and a Texas company reveals allegations of loan sharking in BC casinos.
We've been advised from our bosses that it's not really our business to stick our nose in the business of the loan sharks, that we're there to just watch the games.
CBC initiates a Freedom of Information request for BC gaming documents. They took 4 years to obtain. The documents reveal a troubling pattern of suspicious transactions. The suspicion is that gangsters are using the casinos to launder the proceeds of crime. CBC launches an undercover investigation.
Why don't you guys count the cash?
And successfully uses money laundering techniques to launder $24,000.
What they found through straight up investigative work was they found that there's all these Chinese whales, these huge guys showing up with hockey bags full of cash to exchange for chips at the casino. And that what they noticed was none of this money was coming from Canadian banks. Well, that's interesting. And then so what they found out was that this money was coming from underground Chinese banks that are operating in Canada. And so a lot of people don't know that. There's all these secret banks operating in Canada, specifically for money laundering purposes. Money laundering for what? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But the last step of that plan was laundering it through the casinos. Laundering it into chips, gambling a bit. Baccarat was the game of choice for all these whales. And then sending clean money back over to China, cycling it back in.
I'm sorry to interrupt because I just want to add context because I know a little bit about this.
Okay, perfect.
They call it the shadow banking industry in China. And in case you're like, this is weird, it's just like, loan sharks and mob bosses. No, these are like corporate banks that are just completely off the books. They're on a separate network. And they constitute something like 40% of the entire Chinese economy. Like 40% of all dollars or yen that move in China move through these banks, not through the quote-unquote real banks. So we're talking like trillions of dollars. And that's not like globally. So just for context. Yeah.
Yeah. And it started off in BC. The RCMP has been tracking this for a long, long time and had this, what's known as the silver file. And they said the file had started as a transnational drug trafficking probe focused on a cartel based in mainland China and active around the world, especially in BC, Macau, and Hong Kong. In the beginning, the RCMP suspected there were links to BC casinos, but that wasn't the focus of the investigation. Now, however, undercover officers had identified what they believed was an illegal cash house, purportedly a very busy currency exchange in downtown Richmond. This was Silver International, and that's the name. I think we might mention that on the last episode, but Silver International is this like transnational bank that's used almost exclusively to launder Chinese money and kind of funnel it through these secret underground banks. And there's a description here of how Silver International launders their money. It says this was the basic transaction flow. Drug dealers from China shipped drugs to Vancouver. Gangsters across Canada sold the drugs. The drug cash was collected and deposited at Silver International. One of the gangs, run by this guy named Jin. Jin's gang provided Silver's criminal cash deposits to whale gamblers. The money was washed in the BCLC casinos. And it should be mentioned at this point, the casinos know this. The casinos, they have, you know what a casino is. They got cameras everywhere. They got eyes watching everyone. Everyone knows that, hey, there's this like Chinese guy that keeps showing up with hockey bags of cash. And they would describe, once the RCB went in and looked at the videos, it's like, okay, he would come in, he'd lose some money, he would get up from the table. They're in these special back rooms that are put aside just for the shady gamblers. They watch him go out in the parking lot, stand there. A mysterious black car shows up, hands him another hockey bag full of cash out of the trunk, and they watch him walk back in and keep gambling. And of course, the casinos are thinking, great, fine, look at all this money we're getting. Because they're still getting money. The money's being laundered largely in chips that are then cashed back out, but they're getting a cut. And every step of the way, the casinos, the Canadian casinos, again, these aren't run by Chinese people. These are just Canadian casinos.
Run by Aboriginals.
Yeah, they probably didn't go to the Aboriginal ones. They want to go. The Aboriginals, they don't have the good shrimp cocktails.
Because that's the other thing. We said if Chinese aren't eating Chinese food, they're gambling. But the thing is, they're usually eating the Chinese food at the casino buffet.
Yeah. There's another line here. Let me just get it. He's talking about a presentation given to a Five Eyes conference by this guy named Ward, and the author of this, Sam Cooper, is a pretty famous investigative journalist. Sam Cooper was sort of the guy who had been following the story for years and years and years, and it culminated in this book. And he did just some straight up, old-fashioned journalism of looking into this and digging this story out, because the RCMP and a lot of these places weren't forthcoming with the information. But he said, and I obtained a secret audio recording of Ward's presentation. This was the crucial record that took me inside the RCMP's e-pirate investigation and helped me understand all of the leaked paper records in my cache. It says silver is an illegal money laundering service for criminals, Ward said, and how they were facilitating the purchase and importation of drugs by moving the money around the world for drug dealers. This is not an organized structure with command and control. It is about business relationships because it operates very much parallel to the normal business community. Through surveillance and confidential informants, RCMP intelligence had learned that narcos, loan sharks, illegal casino operators, and the BCLC casino money launderers, lawyers, realtors, mortgage brokers, blah, 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 all networked for mutually beneficial transactions.
Guangdong province in southern China, home to 100 million people, and known to investigators as the world's factory. Here, Chinese transnational crime groups use factories to create chemicals, narcotics, counterfeit goods, and products for illegal export. All of this facilitated by the casinos, VIP gamblers, and organized crime junket lending operators who lend money to VIP gamblers in Macau in the West. And in Hong Kong in the East, by banks, financial firms, and law firms that provide services to global criminals.
I'll just lead with this because I don't know if I might not get to it later, but there's some bullet points you need to know. The drugs that are being brought in through Vancouver is largely heroin. It was heroin in the 80s and 90s, and it is currently fentanyl. And all of these, the production of these drugs are all done in China, in Chinese factories. All of these factories are either directly owned by the Chinese Communist Party or operate under the knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party. This means that the Chinese Communist Party, and China largely, is responsible for all of the fentanyl in North America. And it's mentioned in the book that China itself, the country, China, the government of China, controls the heroin prices in North America. And They've done it before. They've actually tilted it in their favor. So if there's a fentanyl problem in North America, it is being done on purpose by not only Chinese gangsters, but the story here is that the Triads, the Hong Kong Triads, were brought into the fold of the Chinese government. And they operate with the blessing of the Chinese government, and they work hand in glove. Because a lot of the money from the drug trade makes its way back into the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party is essentially a giant fentanyl cartel that has connection. And Silver International, as a international kind of drug laundering bank, has connections to Mexican cartels. Because there's many instances where these triads and these Chinese gangs, one of them is known as the Big Circle Boys. The Big Circle Boys will come up a lot.
Who is Sei Lup?
Well, he's the architect, or the alleged architect, of the largest meth syndicate in history out of China, which was responsible for somewhere around 60% of the meth trade in all of Asia. And he was recently caught by a group of about 20 different agencies that had to get together to catch him. And he was back on his way to Toronto when they caught him in Amsterdam's airport. So he was the largest meth kingpin by orders of magnitude. The profits were about as large as Citibank's. And then, of course, before then, he also ran the most successful heroin distribution network in history out of Toronto in the 1990s. So he's an unusual man in that he's actually run two of the largest drugs networks in history, and on different continents and in different decades.
Tell me about his beginnings, at least, in Toronto. What's his connection to the city, and how did he get started here in Canada?
Well, he was one of the wave of immigrants from Hong Kong who came here before the repatriation of Hong Kong. He was part of the Big Circle Boys even then. So they're gang would be the wrong word. Criminal organization would, I guess, loosely fit what they are. I mean, they're sort of not organized crime, but they are criminals and they are organized, if you know what I mean. They came to Toronto in the 80s and they were apex thieves in Hong Kong. They were running, enormous thefts out of banks and out of jewelry stores in Hong Kong. But when they came to Toronto, they really kind of had to start over because they didn't really understand the networks here. And they began as pickpockets, and then they moved on to large-scale credit card fraud, as well as money laundering. And they even did, TTC tokens, and they created whole new businesses. And then eventually they turned to drugs.
But they will actually trade drugs. So they would trade heroin and fentanyl for marijuana and cocaine coming out of Mexico. So there was they're all working together. So if you hate Mexican drug cartels, the Chinese government is working directly with them. Just to let you know that I want to establish that at the start. And so at that point, you could say, is this just another form of warfare? It could be interpreted as that, I think. Would the Chinese government be upset that there's so many people dying from fentanyl overdoses? I don't know. That seems to work out well for them, maybe. I don't know. But this is just gang warfare is just warfare in this sense. And this was such a big model. It was called the Vancouver model. The Vancouver model is kind of known as the drug money is funneled into Vancouver through Thailand. Then the cash is brought back to Hong Kong by human couriers and then dispersed back into China. So originally that's what they do. They would just actually send people over with cash to cycle it back into China. And this was the leaders of this for the longest time were called the Big Circle Boys. And the Big Circle Boys were sort of a decentralized cartel of industrial criminals out of China who set up a beachhead of drug exports in Vancouver, claiming to be refugees. They're one of probably, if not the biggest cartel in Canada, then one of the biggest cartels. And the book outlines in pretty good detail how they moved in and essentially destroyed the Hells Angels. Whatever drug, influence the Hells Angels had, they were not equipped to deal with, again, pretty much the Chinese government, but they brought so many of the established organized crime in Canada underneath them because they just had more cash, they had more influence, they had more everything. You're kind of dealing with a foreign element at that point. And so he makes a point in there that he has this comment. I don't have it written down, but he says, I know Hells Angels with full patch vests sleeping on park benches right now. But you'll never see a Chinese gangster not driving around in a Maserati. They're at such an untouchable level. And also, this is another way they would launder it later on in case I don't get to it, because I do know we have to get going eventually. But if I don't get to it, the preferred way of laundering this money, once the Vancouver model fell out of fashion, they're not actually trying to cycle it back into China. They're just trying to buy real estate with it. Real estate's a great way to launder money, actually. So all these condo purchases, all these house purchases, a lot of it is done, and real estate investments. So it's not even I'm going to buy a condo. I'm going to buy a house. I'm actually going to open up a construction company and invest in a development. Now I own 30% of a housing development, and then I give those houses to individuals. That's the level they're operating on. They're not buying up real estate. They're making real estate with illicit drug money. And then that's real political capital. So when you hear, and we talked about this last episode, but if people want to know where the rubber meets the road on this, is that once you're at that level of not only real estate purchases, but real estate development, now you can get people elected. And if you get enough small people elected, then you can get an MP elected. Maybe eventually you can have one of your people in the Senate. That's just a matter of time. That's not a matter of dollars. It's going to get there. So the funnel you get into politics and political pressure is through real estate, which they are using as a money laundering, organization. Now, just a little bit about the Big Circle Boys here. There's this guy they're talking about named Kwok Chung Tam. Tam was identified as among the most significant of the Big Circle Boys who hit Canada in waves from about 1986 to 1990, one of the elite gangsters that Dr. Alex Chung of University College London called a decentralized network of career criminals comprised of illegal immigrants from Guangzhou, China. Tam and his big circle associates exploited gaping weaknesses in Canada's border controls, citizenship, and criminal justice systems to establish a Vancouver beachhead from which to dominate the North American drug markets. More than any crime syndicate in Canada and the world, the Big Circle Boys have perfected casino infiltration and money laundering by importing Macau-style underground banking to Vancouver. In the process, the Big Circle Boys have become the biggest factor in the transformation of large portions of British Columbia's casino and real estate industries into narco-economies. And from their power bases in Vancouver and Toronto, they have turned Canada into a springboard to the most lucrative U.S. drug markets: New York, Boston, Seattle, Miami, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and San Francisco, where they have operatives and underground casinos. In the 1990s, the cartel had about twice as many members in Toronto as Vancouver, according to a 2003 report by the Federal Research Division of the but their impact in Vancouver, the smaller of the two Canadian cities, is proportionally much greater. So that's kind of, there's a theme here where, how do all these people get here? And we kind of talked about this last episode too, but basically Canada had this thing where, and we still have it, where anyone can claim to be a refugee. And so Canada, because of this, became a primary entry point for organized crime, because our Supreme Court, especially at the time, would hear literally anyone who had a refugee claim. So there was a report by the RCMP that up to 60% of all refugees have fake papers, fake passports, fake everything. So that's how you ask how the cartel got here. Well, with 60% of applicants just being bullshit, and from a country that's pretty good at faking stuff, yeah, that's how they get in there. And then they never get sent back. And by the time you notice, there's too many of them. What are you going to do? They control everything, right? But the refugee program that's more or less still in operation was the main way they got in. It says they have over 1,000 operatives in Canada. The Big Circle Boys were known to immigration and law enforcement since the 90s, but were somehow always able to fight deportation. That guy I was talking about, Kwok Chung Tam, they knew about him. He was implicated in dozens of home invasions, assaults, murders. And then this is kind of what Sam Cooper is getting at. As he's going through the story, it's everyone knows about these guys. No one's even just deporting them. And they're not just linked to money laundering. It's crime. One of the favorite thing of the Triads and the Big Circle Boys, for people who want to know, every gang has their thing. Every gang has the way they like to dispense justice. The way these Triads would do it, and maybe you have insight on this because I was never in Hong Kong. Their thing was running at you with meat cleavers and hacking at you in public. So, yes. With Muslims, it's all of a sudden, we never heard about acid attacks before. Then one day, now everyone's talking about acid attacks. It never even existed in our zeitgeist. So now we have to add to our zeitgeist, guys getting hacked apart by meat cleavers in the middle of the street. That never happened before. All of a sudden it did. So I wanted to ask you, your time spent in Hong Kong, did you have any run-ins, experience, insight into Triad-related stuff there?
I mean, I did a little bit, not run-ins with them, but you can observe them. When we first moved there, most of the time that we lived in Hong Kong, we were living in poor areas. But when we first got our first place, I guess, it was in one of the poorest and most Triad-infested places in the territory. And we saw a lot of them, but a lot of old heads there that we talked to said the peak for Triads was 60s through 80s, maybe mid 90s. And you did see them still, but they weren't, it's not like before where it was Hong Kong in the 80s was like New York in the 70s. It was just constant blood in the streets. And Hong Kong is not like that now. You do have loads of crime, but it's extremely organized. And the other thing is in Hong Kong, and I guess just kind of what you're touching on, but the Triads, the way that they function in Hong Kong currently, they're essentially like a fifth column for the police and the central government.
Like they don't. There's not a whole lot going on. It's not like they're fighting the police because they work for the police. Like a lot of the stuff that you saw during the umbrella movement protests, where the police wanted to like take down some of these protesters and find them, it was actually the Triads who were coincidentally hunting down the protesters and killing them or disappearing them, not the police. But it's like the Triads were literally doing the work of the Chinese government. So.
Yeah, well, because the peak of what they were referring to, those Chinese people, was there was a time in the 80s when Hong Kong, I might get my timelines mixed up here, but there was a period where Hong Kong was about to be handed back to China from Britain.
Yeah,
and there's all these gangs there, and there was some uncertainty about how the power was going to shake out. So I'll read a part here, but in short, they permitted like a gang war for like a week straight, or like a couple weeks, to like sort it all out. So there was like a period where the city was dominated just by like gang murders to figure out who would take control, and then whoever took control would essentially be an appendage of the government. So it says, meanwhile, regulatory changes were on the horizon in Macau casinos. In January 1995, the Triad started to count down the months until China would retake Hong Kong and Macau. And growing uncertainty about the future of Asian criminal markets triggered a race to secure shares of the Macau VIP rooms before Beijing took control. In August 1995, representatives of the 4 Macau-based Triads, 14K, Shui Fong, Woxing, and the Big Circle Boys, formed a compact called the Four Pacificals to stand united against incursions from the Hong Kong-based Triads. Hold on here. Yeah, and they said that they gave them like a few days to sort it out, and said that's how it was supposed to happen. But after 2 weeks, the fighting just continued. In the early stages, the 14K was winning, but there was too much criminal money at stake for the Shui Fong to bow out. Many Macau police officers were on Triad payrolls already. And so basically it was a giant gang war that also incorporated the police in them as well. It was just shootouts. Like they're just talking about like drive-by shootings, usually with motorcycles and stuff. And then eventually that got consolidated into the Triads you know right now, which again work hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party, more or less. Not it's not like they take orders, but like you had said, they basically work for the fucking police. They're the same, right? And it's funny that once these individuals were coming over, after they took over, they started moving into Canada, they were telling the Supreme Court, they were telling everyone that they're enemies of the Chinese Communist Party, that they're refugees. But once they look at their documents, it shows that they're regularly traveling to China, right? They're always going back and forth to China. Not only that, they have phone records of them talking to the Chinese Communist Party officials. So like a lot of the time you're hearing a story that I'm anti-communist, it's just a fucking lie. And I'm not saying everyone who says that is a liar, but way more than you'd think.
Well, most of them.
Yeah.
Most of them.
Yeah, and it just a note here. In the 2000s, the Big Circle Boys from their industrial facilities in the Golden Triangle switched to synthetic drug production. Once they mastered those skills, they had the blueprint for fentanyl production. So that's the majority of what these organizations are dealing in right now, which makes sense. It's the easiest to produce. There's a line here that, you know, a lot of the Chinese will justify it by saying like the history of this Vancouver model of drug trafficking was like a reaction to the Opium Wars and the 100 years of humiliation to the West that scars the Chinese psyche. And this is why like a lot of these Big Circle Boys, a lot of these gangsters, they come out of like the Maoist regime. Like the Big Circle Boys were a lot of them were like Maoist red paratroopers who were purged from the army for being too extreme. And then they escaped to Hong Kong to become a cartel. And a lot of the Triads themselves actually trace their roots back to around the 1600s. And like rebellions against the government and stuff. I found that stuff kind of interesting. Like they will say that all of this is, you know, it depends if you believe in sort of the Eastern mentality of carrying these old grudges for centuries and centuries. But, you know, maybe I take more of a Western perspective that they just want money, whatever. So the part here, for my ongoing Vancouver model investigation, Project Fallout provided powerful evidence of direct connections among China's government, the Macau casino tycoons, and the Triads. Again, I have to reiterate this point. The Sidewinder report's assessments, so scorned in Ottawa power circles, are supported by Canadian police wiretaps. China's government is, in fact, controlling drug cartels. You still get pushback from this from a lot of like politicians, the implication that, because it does implicate a lot of Chinese businesses too. It implicates most Chinese corporations, like we established on the last episode. Like, you need to look at the Chinese school exchange program differently. You need to look at these nonprofits differently once you know that they're explicitly propaganda tools. On one hand, there's propaganda tools. On the other hand, it's drug trafficking tools. And that's the part that, because here's the other thing, where to make this real for people, when they talk about 60% of the refugee papers and documents being fake, so Vancouver becomes not only a hub for drug trafficking, but also human trafficking. That's the layer to this that doesn't get brought up. That, you know, everyone thinks, oh, like when people think of the Triads, this is something I really want to establish too. When people think of the Triads, I think they think of, you know, Chinese people as more civilized. They see the tycoons and they see the Triad heads up there, nice suits, nice cars, the more dignified, more ancient Oriental Eastern stuff. They're still fucking savages. They're still hacking people to death. They're still doing drive-bys. They're still raping. They're still kidnapping kids. They're still producing child pornography. There's like all this stuff, all the wretched, because people think like, oh, that's like Russian cartel stuff. It's all of them. They're doing the most reprehensible stuff. They're killing people with fentanyl and they think it's funny. They think it's cool and amusing. They're cutting off heads. They're cutting off hands. They're enslaving people. They're, you know, they're killing normal people and not giving a shit. The worst things you could think about, Mexican drug cartels, the Triads are doing as well. That's just what I don't want people to think that it's kind of okay, or it's just like another, it's a shady business. No, like they run fucking rape dungeons as well. And just because you don't think Chinese people are as scary as other types of people, I'm like, no, they can be.
So they shipped it over. But in order for us to get it, each gang had to claim for it. Had to claim how many bricks they want for that month. And there wasn't that much to divide out of. Everybody eventually became more and more greedy. There was like 500 to 1,000 bricks. Everybody had to fucking fight for their share, you know, to claim for their claim. That's how we were, beating the shit out of each other, killing each other just for that couple of bricks. But each brick, we probably bought it for like around 65,000 during that time, and the highest number that we ever sold it for, that I sold it for, was 140. It was more than double the price for one brick, and one brick is pound and a half.
So here's just kind of a summary of the history. In 1997, China took Hong Kong back from the British. Since 1984, when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had announced the handover, there was a flood of migration to the West, accelerated by the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and China would take Macau too in 1999. As a result of this epochal shift, a bloody turf war raged in Macau from 1996 to 1998. No one was safe there. Dozens of gangsters, government officials, and innocent bystanders died. In a poetically tragic irony, the BC government enacted a major change in gambling policy in 1997. The same month that hit the chipped tooth Coy's right-hand man, there's kind of a gangster thing there. That month, the NDP introduced baccarat tables for the first time, extended gambling hours, and increased bet limits. This is kind of the other thing, that right around the time these Chinese tycoons and gangsters show up, the NDP and the Liberal Party specifically, but the NDP, start changing all these gambling laws. That's interesting, because baccarat, like, why baccarat specifically?
Who asked for that? Whose constituents were like petitioning their MP, like, you know what? We need to have like late night $1 million baccarat tables, at like nickel mines up north. That's what we need. We need more of those.
Yeah, the NDP changed the rules, so overnight the maximum bet jumped from 25 to 500 per hand, a 1900% increase at some level, and for some reason, the government decided to bring Macau-style gambling to Canada. And to my mind, it seems that through greed, naivete, willful blindness, when I heard the name of the thing, I clapped, or possibly corruption, Canadian politicians and businessmen had imported Macau's shady economy and its deadly gang war. Whatever the reasons, it was incredibly profitable market disruption. So he's a pro. He's not going to outright say what happened, but he's like, there's a lot of coincidences here. And a lot of the coincidences involve the Liberal Party of Canada, specifically Justin Trudeau, and a lot of NDP individuals. For people who don't know, the NDP is the New Democratic Party. It's sort of like it's a political party in Canada that's further left than the Liberals. Yeah. And it's, to my mind, it's pretty much dominated by, immigrants at this point. Yeah, it's the people too extreme and too like anti-white for the Liberals.
They're part of a coalition that's holding the government together right now as well.
Yeah. And there's like all these cases like just like that, not just NDP, but there's a BC Liberal premier named Joe Clark. Back then, he opens up BC to China's Belt and Road Initiative, even though CSIS, the FBI, and all these other Five Eyes organizations know that the Belt and Road Initiative is the primary vector for Chinese espionage. But then you have suspiciously these politicians opening it up, and like when you have your own intelligence agencies telling you not to do it, but you do it anyway, there's got to be something to that. Yeah. Like when CSIS tells Justin Trudeau, don't sell this company to China, and he does it anyway. When they say, don't own it, don't sell this tech company that creates the technology for our spycraft, don't sell it to China, and then it gets blocked by Stephen Harper the moment Justin Trudeau takes office, he sells it. You gonna tell me that's not fucking suspicious? No. And there's one of the reasons for the delay. There's a case in here of an individual named Cameron Ortis. I'm pretty sure it's Ortis, not Ortiz. Ortis. He was an RCMP analyst, and he was leaking information to China, leaking information to what he calls the narco-terrorists. So he's this guy who's actually, and how many others are there within the RCMP who are trying to gum up the works? And like throughout the book, he's talking about, I try and make, inquiries, and I'm blocked. I'm blocked by individuals with hostility. And CSIS and all these organizations are filled with people who are leaking information to China, to these triads, to block people from knowing about it. There's one case here specifically to show about this guy. So ultimately, Ortiz's expertise on Chinese transnational crime and cyber criminals propelled him to the pinnacle of Canadian intelligence, despite his having no operational experience. And here's something my sources found very strange. One of the U.S. State Department's top national security concerns is Chai Lop-Si, the Canadian big circle boy who may have been the world's top narco before Australian federal police nailed him in the Netherlands as he was preparing to fly to Toronto. Even though C left China in 2010, his network in Toronto is very strong. So in around 2014, the RCMP was informed by Australian federal police that C and the company were running a global crystal meth import-export hub in Markham, right under the nose of the Canadian police forces. This was embarrassing for Ottawa, to say the least. And units that Ortiz influenced started surveillance on his C's deputies in Markham and produced intelligence reports for the Five Eyes. And here's an interesting aside. I'm told that undercover agents who set up at a location in Markham were very surprised to see a senior Canadian elected official in the vicinity of a C group meeting. And here's another mindbender. Some Canadians and Australian federal police got together in 2015 and concluded that C's Toronto network and Jin's network were, of course, working together. This all made perfect sense. But when Ortiz took over the RCMP's National Intelligence Center in 2016, his team suddenly had a very different opinion that the experts in Australian and Canadian anti-gang units. He wasn't interested at all in this gang, in this interconnected network of drug traffickers literally just in Markham, Ontario. So there's case. It's funny because this Ortiz guy, like, he's picked because he's such an expert on China. You know what I mean? Like, he loves China so much. And it's like, oh, the most obvious thing in the world happened. There's so many, like, I don't know how you sort for this. Like, the guys who are so into Mexican drug cartels, but just end up becoming like a cartel asset. Like, it seems inevitable. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you have like the most undercover guys who know so much about Russian culture that they are Russian themselves and then don't become just like a fucking, Russian mob guy.
It's kind of related to what we're saying earlier about the 35-year-old Indian women in positions of power.
Yeah.
Like, that's how these people get hired.
Yeah, there's one last thing I just wanted to establish because I know we got to get going soon. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the fentanyl thing a bit more. So here's a part from page 220. It said, lots of criminals across Canada were selling fentanyl. The vast majority was coming in from mainland China. And many shipments arrived in small postal packages. But according to my sources in BC, at the very top of North America's fentanyl trade were the same people laundering massive piles of cash in BC casinos. It was the network orbiting the Big Circle boys. The same loose coalition of uber criminals that had been running heroin loads into Vancouver ports since Expo 86. And they didn't mess around with Canada Post. They were shipping mountains of fentanyl and methamphetamine precursors into Vancouver. So my sources were saying, if you want to understand fentanyl deaths in North America, visualize a heat map of factories surrounding cities like Wuhan and Guangzhou. And then imagine a multitude of red bands flowing from southern China and landing across the Americas. Sort of like one of those telecommunication network maps. The tiny bands are landing across North America, and the giant red bands are hitting ports in British Columbia and Mexico. This represents the routes of relative volumes of fentanyl. So a lot of people, like, when I say Vancouver is a hub of this stuff, like, you need to understand, like, it's a hub in North America. Vancouver is a landing pad for so much fentanyl and so many slaves. And like, because you think like, oh, fentanyl, it's got to have nothing on Miami. It's worse than Miami. I promise you. Miami is the third stop this shit takes. It goes through Vancouver, through these ports, through this, it's laundered through this real estate. Like, it's actually insane to think about how bad Vancouver is. And I don't think that's mentioned enough. We kind of know it's bad, and you kind of know the Chinese government's involved, but you need to understand, like, the grip these tentacles have and how many people are dying directly from these gangs, specifically the Big Circle boys. It's kind of a silly name, but they're the ones who really rose to the top. And I would recommend this book because it goes into phenomenal detail on some of the characters. I didn't get a chance to go into them today, but it'll go into, very narrative driven stories about where these guys came from. Because a lot of these guys, they're peasants. That's what's so interesting. A lot of these guys, they're not really the people we're talking about in the Triads and the gangs, they come from, and when I say peasants, I mean real peasants. I mean, not Detroit. Detroit is royalty compared to, like, they walk out of a fucking swamp. And it's kind of inspiring to hear the story, but it's like, oh yeah, he opened up a bicycle repair shop, and then within 2 years, he was a heroin trafficker. I don't know how you connect those dots, but apparently it happened enough. But yeah, they end up running factories. Like, they're not underground factories, above ground factories in huge fucking massive buildings where everyone knows, and you got police protection. Imagine how much fentanyl you can produce if you just have like a Ford plant.
Yeah.
Right? It's insane. But yeah, then you see these guys, and they are true savages. They are true, like, gold teeth, will shoot you in your fucking face if you offend them. And again, like I said, there's cases of drive-by shootings, there's assassinations, true mob shit happening. So don't think that it's a more dignified type of crime. It's being brought here, and they're putting other gangs under their thumb, which is, I guess, amusing and sad. A white man can't run a cartel these days.
Yeah, we should try though.
I feel it makes the Hells Angels sound kind of sad right now. Like, I'm angling for the Hells Angels.
Yep.
I watched Sons of Anarchy. I believe that they were cool. Turns out, They're all homeless now. They're all homeless and on heroin and dying of fentanyl. Anyway, so I guess that's all I have time to cover today. That's all I wanted to cover, the big stuff. And I guess we could end. There's one thing. This is the second edition of the book. He mentions at the end that after the release of the book, there were Chinese MPs that were targeted by China for embracing pro-Canada defense positions, but they took a special interest in the Trudeau government. That there is a case to be made that while there's Chinese politicians who aren't in the pocket of the Chinese government. I just want to say, I'm going to be fair. Not all Chinese politicians or professors are spies. But I will say that the Liberal Party is captured by the Chinese Communist Party. And that includes Justin Trudeau. So it's not even just like, oh, I see a Chinese politician, they're bad. No. Our white retards are also bought. And if you look at the stories here, all of the big decisions that were made to allow this to happen were done by these fucking white assholes who are just, I guess we don't know the exact story. It just seems suspicious that all of a sudden you can bet $500 on Baccarat now. Anywho, on this type of gambling that no one but Chinese people does. Who the fuck plays Baccarat?
Like, the U.S. is China's existential enemy, their nemesis, and we are a tiny ant economically compared to China, and we have an open border with the U.S. Like, you have to really jump through a lot of hoops to explain why China wouldn't be exploiting that natural relationship. Like, it's obvious that they would be at least trying to. So,
there's just one line here I thought was kind of interesting. Criminal syndicates working with the government of North Korea are flooding the U.S., Japan, and other countries with counterfeit currency, fake cigarettes, and methamphetamines, the Wall Street Journal reported in 2005, citing a U.S. Secret Service probe against Hong Kong Macau Bank. The network patterns were significant. Casinos, narcos, tycoons, real estate developers, bankers, weapons traffickers, and state actors, all linked to underground mainland China. And that's kind of what I wanted to end at, which is I wanted to say, like, just what a network hub China itself is for international crime, and that there is drug trafficking, and that the overlap with the Chinese government, like if you have this much overlap with criminal cartels, you have a huge overlap with terrorists as well, just by the nature of it. And it's difficult to show exactly where those overlaps are, but they're definitely there. All this dark money shit is related. And I guess that's the one thing to end on. One thing you learn, and this is to your point, I think it's a good place to end on, that America is very disappointed in Canada. Like I said before, how the Australians found out, I was like, oh yeah, you guys realize that you have like an underground drug trafficking operation here, and that's like, oh really? Like, Canada's being told by other intelligence agencies how fucked up we are, and we are a Five Eyes member. Like, this is bad for Canada. Like, of the Five Eyes members, I think Canada has the most damaged reputation. I wouldn't be surprised if Canada is kind of locked out of a lot of decisions right now, because at the highest levels of CSIS, like, they're still trying to figure out what's going on. Like, it's bad. It's fucking embarrassing that it's this bad. And we're compromising a level where America is always like, what the fuck are you doing? And we talked about the last episode, like Pierre Trudeau pursuing such an aggressive trade relationship with China just to spite America. It's like, this is a long history.
Even there, like Pierre Trudeau's relationship with the Cubans and the Russians and the communists, right? Like for more or less for 100 years, Canada's special relationship with the U.S. has made us like the little brother who you needle to get what you want from the big guy. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like the nature of Canadian politics is, it's not just we're in the American shadow, it's that America's enemies always try to fuck us in the ass as a way to get at them.
Like, this starts with Expo 86. Expo 86 in Canada was us starting to pursue that aggressive trade relationship with China. And it mentions in the book, this Expo 86 was done to try and increase Chinese investment in Canada. And right around that same time, we see the emergence of China White, China Heroin, same time. What a coincidence, right?
Whoa.
1 pound of China White cost $5,000 to produce in China. By the time it hits Vancouver, it's selling for $100K. Yeah, so and that's it. It actually started with refugees and started with please invest your money here, and we're not even going to look at where that money's coming from.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.